The auctioneer's hammer dropped with a thud. Sold. For $50. The elderly couple smiled faintly. It wasn't much, but it was something to do. Another forgotten storage unit, probably full of old clothes and broken furniture. When they lifted the door, the smell of dust and rust filled the air. Boxes piled to the ceiling, newspapers yellowed with age, broken toys scattered across the floor. But in the far corner, behind a cracked mirror, they saw something wrapped in a heavy tarp. It was locked and far too clean to belong there. The husband's hands trembled as he cut the rope. What they uncovered that day didn't just change their fortune. It changed the way they saw their entire past. Stay with me until the end, because what they found inside will leave you in absolute disbelief. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Margaret and Harold Winters had been married for 47 years. At 73 and 75 respectively, they lived on a fixed income in a small apartment outside Portland, Oregon. Their weekly routine was simple: grocery shopping on Tuesdays, church on Sundays, and every Saturday morning, they'd drive to storage unit auctions around the city. It started as a hobby 3 years ago when Harold retired from his job at the post office. Margaret had suggested it after watching a reality show about storage hunters. "Maybe we'll find something valuable," she'd said with a laugh. They never did, but the excitement of bidding kept them going. Most weeks, they'd come home with boxes of old books, kitchen appliances that didn't work, or children's toys from decades past. Their apartment was cluttered with these discoveries. Margaret would sort through everything, donating what she could and keeping the occasional treasure. A vintage brooch here, an antique picture frame there. Harold enjoyed the social aspect, chatting with other regular bidders who'd become familiar faces over the months. But this particular Saturday felt different from the moment they arrived at the Sunset storage facility. The morning fog hung heavier than usual, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere as they walked between the rows of metal doors. Harold noticed fewer bidders than normal, maybe a dozen people scattered around, most of them looking bored or distracted. "Not much competition today," Margaret observed, adjusting her cardigan against the morning chill. She carried a small notebook where she kept track of their purchases and expenses, always careful to stay within their modest budget. The auctioneer, a weathered man named Chuck who'd been running these sales for over 20 years, seemed eager to move through the units quickly. The first 3 sales went fast: household furniture, Christmas decorations, and a collection novels that Soul of romanced for $15 each. Then came Unit 247. Chuck cut the lock and rolled up the door with his usual theatrical flair, but his enthusiasm dimmed when he saw the contents. "Well, folks, here we have what appears to be a lifetime's worth of memories," he announced with practiced optimism. "I can. Boxes see furniture, personal effects. Who wants to start the bidding at $100? Silence stretched across the small crowd. The unit looked like every other disappointing storage space they'd encountered. Dusty, disorganized, and filled with the kind of items that usually ended up at garage sales. "75? Chuck tried again. Still nothing. The other bidders had already moved on, checking their phones or walking toward the next unit. Margaret squeezed Harold's arm. She'd spotted something the others had missed. The way the items were arranged wasn't random. Despite the dust and apparent neglect, there was an underlying organization to the placement. Furniture had been carefully positioned to protect smaller items, and the boxes were stacked with deliberate precision. $50? Harold called out, his voice carrying across the nearly empty lot. A few heads turned, but nobody countered. The auctioneer looked around hopefully for a moment, then brought his hammer down. Harold handed over the $50 in cash, their limit for the day, and received the key to their newest acquisition. As the crowd dispersed toward the next unit, Margaret and Harold approached their purchase with the same mixture of excitement and resignation they'd felt dozens of times before. The metal door rolled up with a screech that echoed off the surrounding buildings. The smell hit them immediately. Not the usual mustiness of abandoned belongings, but something cleaner, almost clinical. It reminded Harold of his grandmother's house, where everything had been kept pristine despite years of accumulation. Stepping inside, their eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the doorway. The unit was deeper than it had appeared from outside, stretching back perhaps 20 feet. Along the left wall, furniture had been arranged like a showroom display. A mahogany dining table with 6 matching chairs, a china cabinet filled with dishes, and a leather sofa that looked barely used despite its vintage style. The right wall was lined with boxes, each one labeled in neat handwriting that was still legible despite the years. Christmas decorations, 1987-1995, read one. Sarah's school papers, read another. Wedding photos and memorabilia was written across a larger box near the back, but it was the far corner that drew their attention. Behind an ornate standing mirror with a crack running diagonally across its surface, something large had been covered with a heavy canvas tarp. Unlike everything else in the unit, this item showed no signs of dust or neglect. The tarp looked relatively new, and the way it was secured with rope suggested it had been deliberately protected from time and moisture. Margaret stepped carefully between the boxes, her sneakers crunching on scattered newspaper pages that had been used as packing material. "Harold, look at this," she whispered, though they were alone in the unit. Something about the atmosphere made normal conversation feel inappropriate. The mirror stood at an angle that partially concealed whatever was behind it. Harold joined his wife, and together they moved the heavy piece of furniture aside. The mirror was heavier than expected, and Harold's arthritis made the task difficult, but they managed to shift it enough to reveal what lay behind. The covered object was roughly the size and shape of a large chest or trunk. The tarp had been tied with multiple lengths of rope, creating an almost ceremonial appearance. Unlike the casual way someone might cover outdoor furniture, this had been done with intention and care. Harold ran his fingers along the rope, feeling the quality of the material. It was marine-grade rope, the kind used on boats or for serious outdoor applications. Whoever had covered this item had wanted it to remain protected for a very long time. "Should we open it?" Margaret asked, though her tone suggested she'd already made up her mind. Her hands were already working at one of the knots, her fingers more nimble than Harold's, despite their shared arthritis. As they worked together to untie the ropes, Harold noticed something else unusual about their surroundings. The unit had electrical outlets along the walls, and there were signs that someone had spent considerable time here. A folding chair sat in one corner next to a small table that held an empty coffee mug and what appeared to be a logbook. Harold picked up the logbook while Margaret continued working on the ropes. The entries were brief but regular, spanning several years. Checked seals, all secure, temperature stable, no moisture detected. The final entry was dated just 6 months ago. "Margaret," Harold said quietly, "someone's been taking care of this place. These aren't just abandoned belongings." Margaret paused in her rope work and looked around with fresh eyes. Harold was right. This wasn't the chaotic accumulation of someone who'd simply stopped paying rent. Every item had been placed with purpose, and someone had been maintaining the unit regularly until very recently. The realization should have made them more cautious, but instead, it intensified their curiosity. What was so valuable that someone had spent years protecting it? And why had they suddenly stopped coming? The last knot came free, and Margaret carefully pulled back a corner of the tarp. Underneath was dark wood, polished to a deep shine despite its apparent age. As she pulled more of the covering away, they could see brass fittings and what appeared to be a complex locking mechanism. Harold helped her remove the tarp completely, and they stepped back to look at what they'd uncovered. It was indeed a chest, but unlike anything they'd ever seen. The wood was a rich mahogany that seemed to glow even in the dim light of the storage unit. Brass bands reinforced the corners and edges, and the entire piece was decorated with intricate carvings that depicted scenes of ships, maps, and compass roses. The lock was equally elaborate, not a simple padlock, but an integrated mechanism that appeared to require a key of specific and unusual design. The metalwork around the lock was tarnished with age, but the craftsmanship was extraordinary. Margaret traced her finger along one of the carved ships, feeling the depth and precision of the work. "Harold, this isn't just old. This is antique. This could be worth more than everything else in here combined." Harold nodded, but his attention was focused on something else. Attached to the side of the chest with a small brass chain was a leather pouch, similar to what might hold jewelry or important documents. Unlike the chest itself, the pouch looked modern, as if it had been added recently. Inside the pouch, they found 3 items: a brass key that perfectly matched the chest's lock, a folded letter written on expensive stationery, and a small photograph of a young woman standing beside what appeared to be the same chest, though the photo looked like it had been taken decades ago. Margaret unfolded the letter with trembling hands. The paper was thick and cream-colored, the kind used for formal correspondence. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, as if written by someone elderly or ill. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then I have passed away, and my storage arrangements have lapsed. I pray that whoever finds this chest will understand its significance and treat its contents with the respect they deserve." Harold and Margaret exchanged glances. They were holding someone's final message, a letter written in preparation for death. The weight of that responsibility settled over them as Margaret continued reading. "My name is Captain James Morrison, United States Navy, retired. The chest you have found belonged to my great-great-grandfather, Captain Elias Morrison, who served in the Merchant Marine during the 1800s. What lies inside represents not just family history, but a piece of American maritime heritage that I could never bring myself to donate to a museum or sell to collectors." The letter went on to explain that Captain Morrison had no living heirs and had chosen to store the chest rather than see it dispersed among strangers who might not appreciate its significance. He had hoped to eventually find a maritime museum that would display it properly, but illness had prevented him from making those arrangements. "I have spent the last years of my life maintaining this storage unit and ensuring the chest remained protected," the letter continued. "If you have found this, I ask only that you consider the historical value of what you hold, and that you make decisions about its future with care and wisdom." Margaret's voice had grown softer as she read, and by the time she finished, both she and Harold were silent. They weren't just storage unit buyers anymore. They were custodians of someone's legacy, holders of a trust that had been passed to them by chance and circumstance. Harold took the brass key from the pouch and held it up to the light. It was beautifully crafted, with intricate engravings that matched the decorative elements of the chest. After 47 years of marriage, he and Margaret had learned to communicate without words, and he could see in her expression the same mixture of excitement and reverence that he felt. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting decades for this moment. Harold turned it slowly, feeling the mechanism respond with smooth precision despite its age. The click that followed seemed to echo through the storage unit, breaking a silence that had lasted far too long. Margaret placed her hand on the chest's lid, feeling the cool smoothness of the wood beneath her palm. Together, they lifted it open, and what they saw inside took their breath away completely. The interior was lined with deep blue velvet that had somehow maintained its rich color despite the passing years. Nested within custom-fitted compartments were objects that seemed to belong in a museum rather than a forgotten storage unit. Maritime instruments gleamed with brass and silver, their surfaces polished to mirror brightness. A sextant, a compass, and several other navigational tools lay arranged with military precision. But it was the collection of rolled documents that immediately caught Margaret's attention. Dozens of them, each tied with ribbon and stored in individual compartments, designed to protect them from moisture and light. Harold carefully lifted one and unrolled it on the small table beside the folding chair. It was a ship's chart, hand-drawn with incredible detail. The coastline depicted was unmistakably the Pacific Northwest, but the chart showed features and depths that had meticulously recorded been someone who had sailed these waters extensively. In the corner, written in faded ink, were the words, "Charted by E. Morrison, 1847. Margaret leaned closer, studying the precise markings and annotations that covered the chart. "Harold, look at the level of detail here. Every reef, every safe harbor, every dangerous current. Someone risked their life to create this information." Harold nodded, already reaching for another document. This one was different, not a chart, but what appeared to be a ship's manifest. The header read, "Merchant Vessel Aurora, Cargo Manifest, October 1849. Below that, a detailed list of goods being transported from San Francisco to Portland during the height of the California Gold Rush. The manifest told a story of commerce and adventure that captured their imagination. Bolts of silk from China, barrels of whiskey, mining equipment, and personal effects belonging to families seeking new lives in the Oregon Territory. Each item was recorded with the careful precision of someone who understood that these records might mean the difference between profit and loss, success and failure. As they continued exploring the chest's contents, they discovered that Captain Elias Morrison had been far more than just a merchant sailor. A leather-bound journal revealed him to be a careful observer of the changing American West, documenting not just his voyages, but the transformation of coastal communities during the mid-1800s. One entry, dated March 1851, described the chaos of San Francisco during the gold rush. The city grows by hundreds each day, yet has no infrastructure to support such rapid expansion. Ships arrive faster than they can be unloaded, creating a forest of masts in the harbor. Men abandon vessels to seek gold, leaving captains without crews and ships without purpose. Margaret found herself absorbed in these first-hand accounts of American history. Captain Morrison wrote with Native American tribes, descriptions of Prist about encounters in wilderness areas that would later become major cities, and the challenges of navigating uncharted waters where a single mistake could mean disaster for ship and crew. But it was Harold who made the discovery that would change everything. Hidden beneath the velvet lining of one compartment was a small wooden box, no larger than a jewelry case. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were three items that made both of them gasp audibly. The first was a gold nugget the size of a walnut, its surface marked with the distinctive crystalline formations that indicated it was naturally occurring rather than processed. The second was a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be uncut gemstones, emeralds, sapphires, and rubies that caught the light with inner fire, even in the dim storage unit. The third item was perhaps the most significant of all, a land deed, signed and witnessed, granting ownership of several hundred acres along the Columbia River to Captain Elias Morrison. The deed was dated 1852 and bore the official seal of the Oregon Territory. Harold's hands shook as he held the document up to the light, checking for signs of forgery or damage. The paper was authentic, the kind of thick, handmade stock used for important legal documents in the 1800s. The ink had faded, but remained clearly legible, and the signatures appeared genuine based on the natural variations in pressure and spacing. Margaret sat down heavily in the folding chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what they'd discovered. "Harold, if this deed is legitimate, we're not just holding historical artifacts, we're holding actual property rights." Harold nodded slowly, his mind racing through the possibilities. Property laws in Oregon had evolved significantly since the 1850s, but original territorial deeds often retained legal standing, especially when they could be properly authenticated. The land described in the Chatuit deed encompassed an area that, if it still existed in the Morrison family name, could be worth millions in today's market. But beyond the potential monetary value, they were holding pieces of a story that connected directly to the founding of the Pacific Northwest. Captain Morrison had been present during one of the most transformative periods in American history, and his careful documentation provided an intimate view of events that shaped the nation. The journal entries continued to reveal surprises. Captain Morrison had been involved in early trade relationships with Asian merchants, bringing goods from China and Japan to American ports decades before such commerce became common. He had witnessed the signing of treaties with Native American tribes and had recorded his observations about the cultural exchanges that occurred in frontier communities. One particularly fascinating entry described a meeting with a Chinese merchant in San Francisco who had given Captain Morrison a small jade figurine as a token of respect. Margaret found the figurine exactly where the journal indicated it would be, wrapped in silk and stored in a specially designed compartment that had protected it perfectly for over a century and a half. As they continued exploring the chest's contents, they realized that Captain Morrison had been something of a Renaissance man. Along with his maritime activities, he had dab photography, mineral bled in early prospecting, and even botanical collection. Small specimens of pressed flowers and leaves were preserved between the pages of his journal, along with detailed notes about where and when each had been collected. The photographs were perhaps the most remarkable discovery of all. Using the early daguerreotype process, Captain Morrison had captured images of the Pacific coast as it existed in the 1850s. Pristine beaches, virgin forests, and Native American settlements were documented with startling clarity. These weren't just personal mementos. They were historical records of a world that had vanished forever. Margaret held one photograph up to the light, studying the image of a coastal village that she recognized as the area where Astoria, Oregon now stood. In Captain Morrison's time, it had been little more than a collection of wooden buildings and a small dock. The contrast between that image and the modern city was breathtaking, but Harold had made another discovery that left them both speechless. Hidden in a secret compartment at the bottom of the chest was a collection of letters tied with faded ribbon. The return address on each envelope was the same, from the office of Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States. The letters were brief but significant. President Lincoln had personally commissioned Captain Morrison to serve as an unofficial intelligence gatherer along the Pacific coast during the early years of the Civil War. The Confederate Navy had been attempting to establish supply lines through Pacific ports, and Morrison's knowledge of coastal waters and shipping patterns made him invaluable to Union efforts. One letter, dated 1862, thanked Morrison for his reports on Confederate sympathizers in California and Oregon. Another discussed plans for protecting Union supply ships traveling between San Francisco and Portland. The correspondence revealed that Captain Morrison had played a small but important role in keeping the Pacific coast loyal to the Union during the nation's greatest crisis. Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper as she read excerpts from Lincoln's letters aloud. "Harold, we're holding correspondence from Abraham Lincoln, personal letters from the President of the United States to Harold's great-great-grandfather." The weight of that revelation settled over them like a physical presence. They weren't just random storage unit buyers anymore. They were custodians of American history, holders of documents that belonged in the Smithsonian or the National Archives. As the afternoon wore on, they continued cataloging the chest's contents, each discovery more remarkable than the last. Ship models carved from whalebone, navigation charts of routes that predated official surveys, and personal effects that painted a picture of a man who had lived an extraordinary life during extraordinary times. The final compartment contained something that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. It was a daguerreotype portrait of a young woman in a wedding dress, standing beside a man in a naval uniform. On the back, written in Captain Morrison's careful handwriting, were the words, "My beloved Sarah, 1848, until we meet again in the next world." Below the photograph was a small bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon. These were love letters, written by Sarah Morrison to her husband during his long voyages. The paper was fragile with age, but the words were still clear. Expressions of love, loneliness, hope, and faith that had sustained a marriage across the vast distances and dangers of 19th century maritime life. Harold wiped his eyes as Margaret read portions of the letters aloud. They spoke of everyday concerns, managing the household, caring for children, dealing with the uncertainty of not knowing when her husband would return from his voyages. But they also revealed a woman of remarkable strength and intelligence, someone who understood and supported her husband's dangerous profession despite its personal cost. The letters painted a picture of a love story that had endured despite separation, uncertainty, and the constant threat of disaster that faced merchant sailors of that era. Sarah Morrison had waited months at a time for news of her husband's safe arrival in distant ports, never knowing if each voyage would be his last. As the sun began to set outside the storage unit, Harold and Margaret sat surrounded by the scattered contents of Captain Morrison's chest. They had discovered not just valuable artifacts, but an entire world, a window into American history that few people would ever have the privilege to see. The implications were staggering. The land deed alone could potentially be worth millions if it proved to be legally valid. The historical documents and photographs were priceless from an academic standpoint. The gold nugget and gemstones had obvious monetary value, but their connection to the gold rush era made them even more significant. But perhaps most importantly, they had uncovered a love story that had endured across generations. Captain Morrison's careful preservation of his wife's letters, his detailed documentation of their life together, and his decision to safeguard these memories for posterity spoke to a devotion that transcended time and death. Margaret looked at Harold, seeing her own wonder and uncertainty reflected in his eyes. They had come to the storage auction looking for something to fill their Saturday morning, maybe find a few items they could donate or keep as curiosities. Instead, they had inherited a responsibility that neither of them had ever imagined. The decision about what to do next would require careful consideration. They needed to authenticate the documents, research the legal implications of the land deed, and decide how to honor Captain Morrison's legacy while dealing with the practical realities of their discovery. But as they carefully repacked the chest's contents, both Harold and Margaret knew that their lives had been fundamentally changed. They were no longer just retired people looking for ways to pass the time. They had become guardians of history, keepers of a story that connected them to the very foundations of their nation. The storage unit that had seemed so ordinary that morning now felt like sacred ground. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of determining what their discovery meant and what obligations it carried. But tonight, they would go home with the knowledge that sometimes the most extraordinary treasures are hidden in the most ordinary places, waiting for the right people to find them at exactly the right moment. As they sat in their small apartment that evening, Harold and Margaret spread the contents of Captain Morrison's letter across their kitchen table. The brass key caught the light from their overhead fixture, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Neither of them had spoken much during the drive home, both lost in their own thoughts about the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Margaret picked up the photograph of the young woman standing beside the chest. Something about her face seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen it before. The woman's eyes held a sadness that spoke across the decades, as if she'd known even then that she was part of something larger than herself. Harold had been studying the letter again, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "Margaret, listen to this part again," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He mentions that his great-great-grandfather served in the merchant marine, but he also says there are things in that chest that represent American maritime heritage." She looked up from the photograph. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking Captain Morrison knew exactly what he was storing in that unit. This wasn't just family memorabilia gathering dust. He was protecting something he considered historically significant." Margaret set down the photograph and reached for her reading glasses. Together, they examined the letter more closely, looking for clues they might have missed in their initial excitement. The paper itself told a story, expensive stationery with a watermark they couldn't quite make out in the kitchen light. "Harold, look at the date on this letter," Margaret said, pointing to the top corner. "It was written just 8 months ago. That means Captain Morrison was planning this right up until the end. The implications sent a chill through both of them. Someone had spent their final months carefully orchestrating this moment, ensuring that whoever found the chest would understand its significance. It wasn't random chance that had led them to Unit 247. It was destiny, carefully arranged by a dying man who had no other way to ensure his family's legacy would survive. Harold stood up and walked to their small kitchen window, looking out at the city lights of Portland. Somewhere out there, the storage facility sat in darkness, holding secrets they'd only begun to uncover. "Margaret, what if we're not the first people to find that chest?" She looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Think about it. Captain Morrison maintained that unit for years. The logbook showed regular visits, careful maintenance. But what if someone else knew about it? What if there were other people looking for exactly what we found?" The thought hadn't occurred to Margaret, but now it seemed obvious. A chest containing potentially valuable historical artifacts wouldn't remain secret forever. Maritime historians, antique dealers, treasure hunters, any number of people might have learned about Captain Morrison's storage unit through research or word of mouth. "You think we might be in danger?" she asked, though the question sounded almost ridiculous in their quiet apartment. Harold returned to the table and sat down heavily. At 75, he'd seen enough of the world to know that valuable discoveries often attracted unwanted attention. "I think we need to be careful about who we tell and how we proceed." Margaret nodded, understanding immediately. Their Saturday morning hobby had transformed into something that required serious consideration and planning. The gold nugget alone was probably worth thousands of dollars, and the historical documents could be priceless to the right collectors. But more than the monetary value, they both felt the weight of responsibility that Captain Morrison had placed on their shoulders. His letter had been a plea from beyond the grave, asking them to treat his family's legacy with respect and wisdom. "We need to research the Morrison family," Margaret said, her practical nature taking over. "If Captain Morrison had no living heirs, then legally everything in that chest belongs to us through the storage auction. But we should verify that claim." Harold agreed. "And we need to authenticate the documents. That land deed especially. If it's legitimate, we're talking about property that could be worth millions." They spent the next hour making lists of what needed to be done. Research the Morrison family genealogy. Consult with maritime historians about the significance of the documents. Have the land deed examined by a property lawyer. Get the gold nugget and gemstones appraised by certified professionals. Each step would require discretion and careful selection of trustworthy experts. Word of their discovery could easily reach the wrong people if they weren't cautious about who they approached for help. Margaret picked up the brass key again, turning it over in her palm. "Harold, what if the chest isn't the only thing Captain Morrison left behind? What if there are other storage units, other hiding places?" The possibility hadn't occurred to Harold, but it made perfect sense. Someone who had gone to such elaborate lengths to protect one collection might have created multiple backup plans. The logbook mentioned checking seals. Maybe he was maintaining more than just the chest. They decided to return to the storage facility the next morning, not to retrieve more items, but to ask questions. Chuck, the auctioneer, had been running sales there for 20 years. He might remember Captain Morrison, might know something about other units or storage arrangements. As they prepared for bed that night, both Harold and Margaret felt the strange sensation of standing on the edge of something much larger than themselves. Their retirement had been comfortable but predictable, filled with small pleasures and quiet routines. Now they were custodians of American history, holders of secrets that could rewrite maritime records and potentially make them wealthy beyond their modest dreams. But wealth wasn't what excited them most. It was the story itself. The romance of Captain Elias Morrison's adventures, the tragedy of his separation from his beloved Sarah, the mystery of how his descendant had come to possess such remarkable artifacts. Margaret lay awake long after Harold had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the woman in the photograph. What had her life been like? married to a sea captain in the 1800s. How many nights had she spent wondering if her husband would return from his voyages? How had she managed to maintain hope and love across such vast distances and dangers? The next morning dawned gray and drizzle, typical Portland weather that matched their subdued mood as they drove back to the Sunset storage facility. Chuck was already there, setting up for another auction, his weathered face showing the effects of decades spent outdoors in all kinds of weather. "Harold, Margaret," he greeted them with surprise. "Don't tell me you're having buyer's remorse already. Yesterday's purchase not work out?" Harold shook his head. "Actually, we were hoping you might remember the previous renter of Unit 247. A Captain Morrison?" Chuck paused in his setup, his expression becoming thoughtful. "Jimmy Morrison. Yeah, I remember him. Nice old fellow. Very particular about his unit. Always paid on time, never caused any trouble. He passed away about 6 months ago." Margaret stepped forward. "Did he ever mention what he was storing there?" "Family items," he said. "Sentimental stuff that he couldn't bear to get rid of but didn't have room for at home. He came a few weeks to check on things, which by every always thought was unusual. Most people store stuff and forget about it." Chuck continued working as he talked, but Harold could see the man's curiosity was piqued. "Why do you ask? Find something interesting in there?" Harold and Margaret exchanged glances, both remembering their decision to be discreet. "Just some old family documents that might be historically significant," Harold said carefully. "We wanted to make sure we handle them properly." "That sounds like Jimmy," Chuck nodded approvingly. "He was always talking about history, especially maritime stuff. Said he'd spent his whole career in the Navy and had a deep appreciation for the old sailing days." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "Did he ever mention having other storage arrangements? Other facilities or units?" Chuck stopped what he was doing and looked at them directly. "You know, now that you mention it, he did ask me once about climate-controlled units. Said he had some items that needed extra protection from temperature and humidity, but we don't offer that service here, so I referred him to a couple of other facilities in town." Harold pulled out a small notebook and pen. "Do you remember which facilities?" "Northwest Storage Solutions on the east side, and Premium Storage downtown. Both of them have climate-controlled units. Jimmy was very specific about needing that feature." As they drove away from the Sunset facility, Margaret felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. If Captain Morrison had maintained additional storage units, what might they contain? More historical documents? Additional artifacts from his great-great-grandfather's maritime career? Or perhaps something even more significant? Their first stop was Northwest Storage Solutions, a modern facility with electronic gates and security cameras. The manager, an efficient-looking woman in her 40s, listened politely to their inquiry, but shook her head regretfully. "I'm sorry, but I can't provide information about our renters without proper legal documentation. Privacy policies, you understand. If you believe you have a legal claim to someone's stored property, you'll need to work through the courts or with an attorney." The response was disappointing, but not unexpected. Premium Storage downtown gave them the same answer, delivered with professional courtesy but absolute firmness. They would need legal assistance to access any additional units that Captain Morrison might have maintained. Driving home through the Portland traffic, Harold voiced what they were both thinking. "We need a lawyer, someone who specializes in estate law and property rights." Margaret nodded. "And we need to be prepared for the possibility that this is going to get complicated. If Captain Morrison maintained multiple storage units, if there are valuable historical artifacts involved, if that land deed is legitimate, we could be looking at legal battles that last for years." The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. They were retired people on fixed incomes who had stumbled into something that could require significant financial resources to resolve properly. Legal fees, authentication costs, security measures to protect their discoveries. The expenses savings easily exceed their modest cool. But they were also holding what might be one of the most significant maritime historical finds in decades. The documents in Captain Morrison's chest could fill gaps in historical records, provide new insights into the development of the Pacific Northwest, and honor the memory of people who had lived extraordinary lives during extraordinary times. That afternoon, Harold made calls to 3 law firms that specialized in estate and property law. The conversations were brief but informative. Each attorney expressed interest in their case but warned that authentication and legal verification could be expensive and time-consuming processes. The third lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had handled several high-profile historical artifact cases, agreed to meet with them the following Monday. Her fee structure was reasonable, and she seemed genuinely intrigued by the maritime historical aspects of their discovery. Margaret spent the weekend researching everything she could find about the Morrison family online: public records, genealogy websites, maritime historical societies. She cast a wide net, looking for any information that might shed light on their discovery. What she found was both encouraging and puzzling. Captain James Morrison, the letter writer, had indeed been a retired Navy captain who had passed away 6 months earlier. His obituary mentioned no surviving family members and noted his lifelong interest in maritime history and genealogy. But Captain Elias Morrison, his great-great-grandfather, was harder to trace. Maritime records from the 1800s were incomplete, and many documents had been lost to time, fire, and natural disasters. Margaret found scattered references to ships that might have been commanded by an E. Morrison, but nothing definitive enough to authenticate their discovery. The land deed presented its own challenges. Property records from the Oregon Territory period were notoriously complex, with overlapping claims, disputed boundaries, and administrative chaos that had taken decades to sort out. Even if the deed was authentic, determining its current legal status would require extensive research and probably court proceedings. Harold spent his weekend in a different kind of research, visiting the Portland Maritime Museum and the Oregon Historical Society. He didn't reveal the specific nature of their discovery, but he asked general questions about maritime artifacts, authentication procedures, and the historical significance of merchant marine documents from the mid-1800s. The responses he received were encouraging. Maritime historians were always excited about new discoveries, especially primary source documents from the Pacific Coast's early commercial period. Several experts he spoke with emphasized that even relatively minor artifacts could provide valuable insights into daily life during the nation's westward expansion. By Sunday evening, both Harold and Margaret felt more confident about the legitimacy and potential significance of their discovery. They had a plan for proceeding legally and professionally, expert contacts who could help with authentication, and a growing understanding of the historical context that made their find so remarkable. But they also had a growing awareness of the challenges that lay ahead. Legal proceedings could take years and cost thousands of dollars. Authentication would require exposing their discovery to scrutiny from experts who might have their own interests in maritime artifacts. And if their find proved to be as valuable as they suspected, they might face challenges from unexpected quarters. Distant relatives, government agencies, or other parties claiming rights to the Morrison family legacy. Monday morning's meeting with Patricia Chen confirmed both their hopes and their concerns. The attorney listened carefully to their story photographs, examined the key documents, and provided a realistic assessment of what lay ahead. If these documents are authentic, she said, you're looking at a discovery that could have significant historical and monetary value. But authentication will be expensive. Legal proceedings could be lengthy, and you'll need to be prepared for challenges from various parties who might claim interest in the artifacts. She outlined a strategy that would begin with professional authentication of the most significant documents, followed by genealogical research to confirm Captain Morrison's family status, and finally legal action to establish clear ownership of any discovered property rights. The initial costs would be substantial, several $1,000s just for the authentication phase. But Patricia also explained that if their discovery proved as valuable as it appeared, those costs could eventually be recovered through sale or donation of the artifacts to appropriate institutions. Harold and Margaret left the meeting with mixed feelings. They were committed to proceeding, but they also understood that they were embarking on a journey that could consume years of their remaining lives and most of their financial resources. That evening, as they sat in their apartment looking at the brass key that had started everything, Margaret voiced the question that had been bothering her all day. "Harold, what if Captain Morrison made a mistake? What if we're not the right people for this responsibility?" Harold considered the question seriously before answering. "I think Captain Morrison chose very carefully. He could have donated these items to museums while he was alive. He could have tried to sell them to collectors or historians. Instead, he chose to leave them to chance, to let fate decide who would inherit his family's legacy." Margaret nodded slowly. "You think he wanted ordinary people to find them? People who would appreciate the human story as much as the historical significance. I think he wanted people who would care more about preserving his great-great-grandfather's memory than about making money from his artifacts." The thought comforted them both. They weren't treasure hunters or professional antiquarians. They were retired people who had stumbled into an extraordinary situation and were trying to handle it with dignity and respect for the people whose lives had made their discovery possible. The authentication process began the following week with a visit from Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a maritime historian from Portland State University who specialized in Pacific Coast commercial shipping during the 19th century. Patricia Chen had recommended Dr. Harper as one of the most respected experts in the field. Dr. Harper's reaction to the documents was everything Harold and Margaret had hoped for. Her eyes widened as she examined Captain Elias Morrison's ship charts, and she actually gasped when she saw the ship's manifest from 1849. "These are remarkable," she said, her voice filled with professional excitement. "If they're authentic, they represent some of the most detailed primary source documentation I've ever seen from this period. The level of detail in these charts is extraordinary." She spent 3 hours examining every document, making notes and taking photographs with their permission. The land deed particularly intrigued her, not just for its potential monetary value, but for what it revealed about early territorial land grants and the relationships between maritime commerce and westward expansion. "I'll need to take some of these documents to the university for more detailed analysis," Dr. Harper explained. "We have equipment that can analyze paper composition, ink chemistry, and aging patterns to determine authenticity. The process will take about 2 weeks." Harold and Margaret agreed, understanding that professional authentication was essential if they hoped to establish the legal and historical legitimacy of their discovery. They watched nervously as Dr. Harper carefully packed the most significant documents in archival containers for transport to her laboratory. The waiting period was difficult. Every day brought new questions and concerns about what they had set in motion. But it also brought new discoveries as they continued exploring the contents of Captain Morrison's chest with fresh eyes and growing understanding. The love letters between Captain Elias Morrison and his wife Sarah proved to be particularly revealing. They painted a picture of a marriage that had endured despite the enormous challenges of maritime life in the 1800s. Sarah's letters revealed her to be an intelligent, strong-willed woman who had managed family finances, property, and business affairs, while her husband was at sea for months at a time. One letter, dated 1850, mentioned investments that Captain Morrison had made in Portland real estate and timber rights. Sarah wrote about overseeing construction of rental properties and managing tenant relationships, suggesting that the Morrison family had been involved in the early commercial development of the Pacific Northwest. The implications were staggering. If the land deed was authentic, it might represent only a fraction of the Morrison family's historical property holdings. There could be additional deeds, property records, and business documents that would establish claims to land that was now worth millions of dollars in modern Portland. But Harold had noticed something else during their examination of the letters. Several envelopes bore postmarks from cities he'd never heard of, places with names like New Astoria and Morrison's Landing. When he mentioned this to Margaret, she pulled out a modern map of Oregon and began comparing it to the locations mentioned in the correspondence. "Harold, look at this," she said, tracing her finger along the Columbia River. "Some of these place names don't exist anymore, but the geographic descriptions match areas that are now part of major cities." The realization hit them both simultaneously. Captain Elias Morrison hadn't just been a merchant sailor passing through the Pacific Northwest. He had been one of its founding settlers, establishing trading posts and communities that had eventually grown into modern urban centers. Margaret found a reference in one of Sarah's letters to the new settlement at Morrison's Landing, where Elias has established a trading post for ships traveling between California and the Northern Territories. The description matched perfectly with an area that was now part of downtown Portland's waterfront district. Harold felt his pulse quicken as the implications became clear. "Margaret, if Captain Morrison established settlements that became part of modern cities, then that land deed might not just cover empty wilderness. It could include property that's now in the heart of Portland's commercial district." The possibility was both thrilling and overwhelming. They were potentially holding documents that could establish ownership claims to some of the most valuable real estate in Oregon. But they were also dealing with legal complexities that stretched back over a century and a half. Margaret pulled out her laptop and began searching for historical records. What she found confirmed of early Portland settlements their growing suspicions. References to Morrison's Landing appeared in several historical accounts of Portland's founding, though most historians had assumed it was named after a different Morrison family. "Harold, listen to this," she said, reading from a digital archive of Oregon territorial records. In 1852, a trading post established by Captain E. Morrison served as the primary supply depot for ships traveling between San Francisco and Puget Sound. The post included warehouses, residential buildings, and a small dock that eventually became part of Portland's original waterfront. Harold sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were discovering. Their $50 storage unit purchase was revealing connections to the very foundations of their city. Captain Elias Morrison hadn't just passed through Oregon during the Gold Rush era. He had helped build it. But with each new discovery came new questions and concerns. If their documents established legitimate historical claims to valuable urban property, they would almost certainly face legal challenges from current property owners, city governments, and various other parties with competing interests. Patricia Chen had warned them that property disputes involving historical claims could drag on for decades, consuming enormous resources and generating intense public scrutiny. They were retired people who had wanted to spend their remaining years in quiet comfort, not embroiled in legal battles that could dominate the rest of their lives. Yet they also felt a growing obligation to honor Captain Morrison's trust and preserve his family's legacy. The documents they'd discovered weren't just valuable artifacts. They were proof of contributions that had shaped the development of the Pacific Northwest. Captain Elias Morrison and his wife Sarah deserved to be remembered for their role in American history. Margaret closed her laptop and looked at Harold with an expression that mixed determination with apprehension. "We can't ignore this, can we? Even Plickett's hour if it lives beyond anything we ever imagined." Harold nodded slowly. At 75, he'd learned that some responsibilities couldn't be avoided, regardless of their inconvenience or difficulty. They had become custodians of American history, and that obligation transcended their personal comfort or financial concerns. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. Dr. Harper's voice carried barely contained excitement as she delivered her preliminary findings. "Harold, Margaret, I have extraordinary news. The documents you found are absolutely authentic. The paper composition, ink chemistry, and aging patterns all confirm that these artifacts date from the mid-1800s. But more importantly, The historical significance of what you've discovered is beyond anything I initially imagined. She went on to explain that the ship's charts contained navigational information that filled gaps in historical records. Several of Captain Morrison's documented routes had been considered lost to history, and his detailed observations provided new insights into Pacific Coast commerce during the Gold Rush era. The land deed has been examined by a colleague who specializes in territorial property law, Dr. Harper continued. While establishing its current legal status will require extensive research, the document itself is unquestionably authentic. You're holding a legitimate land grant from the Oregon Territory. Harold felt his hands trembling as he absorbed the implications. They weren't just dealing with historically interesting artifacts anymore. They were holding documents that could establish legitimate property claims worth millions of dollars. Dr. Harper's next words confirmed their growing understanding of the situation's complexity. I need to warn you that word of this discovery is going to spread quickly through academic and legal circles. Maritime historians, property lawyers, and various government agencies are going to be very interested in what you found. Margaret felt a chill of apprehension. Their quiet retirement was about to become very public and very complicated. Dr. Harper, what do you recommend we do? Get excellent legal representation immediately. Document everything, and be prepared for significant attention from people who might not have your best interests at heart. After ending the call, Harold and Margaret sat in their kitchen staring at the brass key that had started everything. In just 1 week, their lives had been transformed from comfortable predictability to extraordinary uncertainty. Margaret picked up the photograph of Sarah Morrison, studying the young woman's face with new understanding. Sarah had lived through the chaos and opportunity of America's westward expansion, supporting her husband's dangerous profession while managing property and business affairs that had helped build a city. Harold, I think I understand why Captain Morrison chose to leave these documents to chance, rather than donating them to a museum or selling them to collectors. Harold looked up from the land deed he'd been examining. What do you mean? He wanted ordinary people to find them. People who would understand that this isn't just about money or historical significance. It's about honoring the memory of people who built something lasting with their lives. Harold nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle over him like a mantle he couldn't remove. They weren't treasure hunters who had gotten lucky. They were inheritors of a trust that connected them to the very foundations of their community. The brass key caught the morning light streaming through their kitchen window, casting dancing shadows on the wall. Somewhere in Portland, there might be other storage units containing additional pieces of the Morrison family story. Climate-controlled facilities where Captain Morrison had preserved other artifacts from his great-great-grandfather's extraordinary life. Margaret reached for the telephone book, her practical nature taking over despite the overwhelming circumstances. If there were other discoveries waiting to be made, they needed to find them before word of their initial find spread too widely. Harold, we need to contact those other storage facilities. If Captain Morrison rented climate-controlled units, we need to know about them before anyone else starts looking. Harold agreed, understanding that time was now their most precious resource. Once news of their discovery became public, every aspect of their investigation would become more complicated and potentially more dangerous. They spent the morning making phone calls, this time armed with Patricia Chen's legal letterhead and Dr. Harper's academic credentials. The combination of legal authority and scholarly interest opened doors that had been firmly closed during their initial inquiries. Northwest Storage Solutions confirmed that Captain Morrison had indeed maintained a climate-controlled unit until his death 6 months earlier. The facility manager agreed to meet with them that afternoon, provided they brought proper legal documentation establishing their rights to the deceased renter's property. Premium Storage downtown provided similar confirmation, though their unit had been smaller and had apparently contained primarily documents rather than artifacts. Both facilities had been paid through automatic bank drafts that had continued for 3 months after Captain Morrison's death, before being stopped by his estate's executor. Margaret felt her excitement building as they prepared for the afternoon meetings. If Captain Morrison had maintained multiple storage facilities, the scope of their discovery could be far larger than they had initially imagined. But Harold's expression remained troubled as he gathered the legal documents they would need. "Margaret, I keep thinking about what Dr. Harper said about people who might not have our best interests at heart. What if we're not the only ones who know about these other storage units?" The thought had been nagging at Margaret as well. Captain Morrison had maintained his storage arrangements for years, making regular visits and keeping detailed records. It seemed unlikely that such activities could remain completely secret, especially from people who might have professional or financial interests in maritime historical artifacts. "We'll be careful," Margaret said, though she wasn't entirely sure what being careful meant in their current circumstances. They were dealing with forces and interests that extended far beyond their experience or understanding. As they drove toward the Northwest storage facility, Harold noticed a dark sedan that seemed to be following them through several turns and traffic lights. When he mentioned it to Margaret, she glanced in the side mirror and felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. "Harold, maybe we should call Patricia Chen before we go any further. If someone is following us, this situation might be more dangerous than we realized." Harold pulled into a parking lot and called their attorney from his cell phone. Patricia Chen's response was immediate and concerned. "Don't go to those storage facilities alone. Meet me at my office and we'll discuss how to proceed safely." The realization that they might be in physical danger added a new dimension to their situation that neither Harold nor Margaret had anticipated. They were no longer just dealing with legal and financial complexities. They were potentially dealing with people who might use intimidation, or worse, to claim the Morrison family artifacts. As they sat in Patricia Chen's office an hour later, surrounded by law books and legal documents, the full scope of their situation became clear. They had discovered artifacts that could be worth millions of dollars and could establish property claims that might be worth tens of millions more. Such stakes inevitably attracted attention from people who viewed historical artifacts as commodities to be bought, sold, or stolen, rather than cultural treasures to be preserved and honored. Patricia Chen's advice was sobering but necessary. "From this point forward, you don't go anywhere alone. You don't discuss your discovery with anyone unless I'm present. And you don't access any additional storage units without proper security arrangements." Harold and Margaret exchanged glances, both realizing that their quiet retirement had ended permanently. They were now players in a game with rules they didn't understand and stakes they couldn't fully comprehend. But they were also the inheritors of Captain Morrison's trust, custodians of a history. Whatever story that connected them to the very foundations of American dangers lay ahead. They couldn't abandon the responsibility that had been placed in their hands by a dying man's careful planning. The brass key that had started everything rested in Margaret's purse, no longer just a curiosity from a storage auction, but a symbol of their commitment to honor the Morrison family legacy regardless of the personal cost. As the afternoon sun slanted through Patricia Chen's office windows, casting long shadows across the legal documents spread on her desk, Harold and Margaret began to understand that their greatest adventure was just beginning. Harold and Margaret Winters walked into that storage auction with $50 and a simple Saturday routine. They walked out as custodians of American history, holders of documents that could rewrite maritime records and establish property claims worth millions. The brass key that unlocked Captain Morrison's chest didn't just open a trunk, it opened a window into the extraordinary lives of people who helped build the Pacific Northwest from nothing but courage and determination. Today, as legal proceedings continue and authentication processes unfold, Harold and Margaret remain committed to honoring Captain Morrison's final wish. They've discovered that sometimes the most valuable treasures aren't gold or gemstones, but the stories of ordinary people who lived extraordinary lives during extraordinary times. Their $50 gamble became a $1 million responsibility, proving that history's greatest secrets often hide in the most unexpected places. waiting for the right people to find them at exactly the right moment. What would you do if you discovered artifacts that could change everything you thought you knew about your city's history? Let me know in the comments below.